In the dark underbelly of the Imperium, truth is never given, only stolen. And when it is stolen, it is paid for in blood. The story of life among the fallen angels of chaos is not one told in open voxcasts or sanctioned tomes. It bleeds out from half-burnt data slates, whispered between prisoners awaiting sacrifice, carried in the shrieks of those who have seen too much. You cannot measure such a life by days or years, but by what it strips from you: memory, flesh, faith, until nothing is left but service to powers that will never remember your name. This is not a tale of glory. It is the ledger of what happens when loyalty is broken and remade in fire. Before we descend further, remember to anchor yourself to the signal of this channel. Like, share, and subscribe, not as a ritual, but as the one sure way to keep these transmissions alive against the tide of silence. What follows is a 20-part descent. Each chapter unspools a layer of what it means to exist where the Emperor's light has never reached. Among those who traded his Aquila for the marks of darker patrons, the ash clung to everything. It coated the rusting girders, the broken conveyor belts, the skeletal cranes that reached into a sky that no longer changed color. It clung to the mouths of those still breathing, grinding between their teeth until every swallow tasted of grit. The manufactorum had not produced anything sanctioned in decades, yet its chimneys still bled smoke. The workers, half-starved and bent from years of servitude, did not question why. Their lungs ached, their stomachs hollowed, but the rhythm of existence remained. Inhale soot, exhale dust, and pray that the next shift did not bring collapse. The air itself seemed to scrape them thinner each day, as though the world wanted to wear them down into nothing but residue. The hunger was worse than the ash. Bellies snarled so loud they drowned out the sermons piped through cracked The ecclesiarchy had abandoned this quarter generations ago, but still the old records played, their words warped into droning echoes. The Emperor provides. No one believed it. Children gnawed on wire insulation, their lips bleeding copper. Mothers boiled leather straps until they softened into something chewable. Old men chewed rags, hoping saliva might fool their bodies into thinking food had passed their throats. And when the weak dropped, no one wasted time with burial. They were carried into the ash pits. The ground did the rest. Nothing remained but soot. It was here, among the choking haze, that whispers began to slip through the cracks. No heralds, no banners, just words carried by lips cracked from thirst, spoken too softly to be sermons, too steady to be hallucinations. They did not promise salvation, they promised bread. They did not demand prayer, they demanded obedience. It began small. A woman returning from her shift with a heel of mold-streaked bread, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and triumph. When asked where she had found it, she only whispered, "They gave it to me." No one asked who they were. Everyone understood without speaking. At first, no one admitted to listening. Those who spoke too openly about the bread vanished, sometimes taken in the night, sometimes simply collapsing mid-shift, their lungs clawed apart by more than soot. But those who returned carried food in their hands, or scars etched into their flesh, and hunger outweighed fear. Men who had sworn oaths to the Aquila found themselves bending low in shadows, repeating words they could not remember after they spoke them. They rose with bellies full and eyes hollow. The manufactorum floor was soon split between those who still starved and those who had begun to change. You could smell it, the difference. The faithful reeked of sweat and iron dust. The others smelled of oil and copper, as if their blood had turned metallic. Children learned faster than the adults. A boy who had once cried for food now walked calmly with crusts in his hand. His parents tried to ask where he had found them, but he only stared, expression blank, eyes wide as the void between stars. His lips trembled as though repeating a prayer, but no sound emerged. That night, the family ate. The next morning, the boy's skin bore faint lines, not scars, not bruises, patterns. The shapes seemed geometric, precise, as though carved by an artisan's chisel. His parents wept, not because they feared what he had become, but because they were grateful. They had eaten. Gratitude outlived horror. Work in the manufactorum began to shift. Machines that had grown for centuries started moving with renewed rhythm. Servitors, those whose flesh had not yet completely rotted, jerked into motion without tech priest commands. Conveyor belts rolled, not with sanctioned goods, but with twisted constructs of scrap and bone. No one remembered authorizing these designs. No one dared question them. Overseers barked less. The workers moved with a strange unity. Their exhaustion eased not by food, but by something deeper, something unseen pressing against the marrow of their bones. They did not speak of chaos. They did not speak of gods. They spoke of the next meal, the next breath, the next command. Refusal was still possible, at least in the beginning. A few clung to their oaths, clutching fragments of Aquilas scratched into rusted metal, muttering the litanies of survival. They turned away when offered bread. They spat into the ash when whispers curled in their ears. One by one, they vanished. Some were dragged screaming into the smokestacks, their bodies flung into furnaces that had not burned fuel in years. Others simply dissolved, their flesh unraveling like ash caught in a gust. Their absence was not discussed. Silence became survival. You either ate what was offered, or you became nothing worth remembering. The whispers grew stronger. They began to seep into the dreams of the starving. Men dreamed of feasts that never ended, tables groaning with meats that pulsed like living muscle. Women dreamed of drinking rivers of blood so sweet it numbed their teeth. Children dreamed of fire that did not burn, but embraced. And when they woke, the taste of it lingered on their tongues. They arose hungrier than before, desperate enough to seek the shadows where voices waited. Slowly, the manufactorum stopped belonging to the Imperium. It belonged to something else, something that promised just enough sustenance to keep its slaves alive, just enough strength to keep their hands moving, just enough vision to keep them blind. Ash clung thicker. Breathing became harder, but no one noticed anymore. Their lungs had adjusted, or perhaps forgotten how to rebel. What mattered was obedience. The manufactorum had always consumed lives. Now it consumed souls, and those who lived through it did not think of survival as a gift. They thought of it as the only currency they had left. The clatter of iron shackles was the true heartbeat of the manufactorum's lower halls. It echoed louder than the engines, louder than the overseer's commands, louder even than the coughs of men who spat black. Prisoners marched in files that never ended, their bodies bent, their wrists rubbed raw, iron rings biting deeper until skin became scar tissue, and scar tissue became part of the shackle itself. To be taken alive was never mercy. Chains did not stop at the flesh. They wormed into the mind. They stripped away the weight of choice until all that remained was motioned 1 foot forward. One more weight hoisted, one more day survived. The chains became devotion, not by prayer, but by repetition, and devotion always demanded more. The prisoners had once been soldiers, rebels, debtors, heretics, innocents caught in sweeps. None of it mattered now. Their identities were forgotten in the endless rhythm of labor. Some still whispered their names to themselves at night, mouthing them silently like contraband. But with each passing month, even that faded. The names were replaced with numbers, with work shifts, with designations barked from rusted vox horns. And as names withered, so too did the memory of why they resisted. A man who had once sworn an oath to the Astra Militarum could no longer remember the taste of clean water. A woman who had carried the icon of her ancestors could no longer recall what prayer it was meant to protect her from. Chains were stronger than memory. Chains were stronger than faith. The iron halls groaned with the sound of machines that were older than recollection, their gears grinding with hunger. The prisoners fed them. They carried promethium drums so heavy that bones splintered beneath the strain. They heaved broken engine parts into place, with hands blistered until blood slicked the metal. Overseers with shock staves struck at laggards until screams bled into the rhythm of industry. Each day was an altar, each act of forced labor a sacrifice. And yet, no blood spilled here ever reached the Emperor's sight. The chains directed it elsewhere, for whispers gathered in the cracks, not spoken by men, not spoken by overseers. They leaked from the machinery itself, from the gaps where oil met bone, where rivets gleamed wet with something thicker than grease. At first they seemed like hallucinations, the mutterings of fevered minds pushed too far. But when the same phrase rolled through dozens of skulls at once, when dreams became identical, the prisoners understood. The warp had found its way in. The promises it whispered were not of freedom in the old sense, not of shattered chains or open skies. Its promises tasted of release that came with new bindings, flesh grafted to steel, devotion traded for strength, damnation draped as salvation. Some resisted. They gritted their teeth, forced themselves to hear only the clank of chains, the bark of orders, the crackle of shock staves. They clung to the smallest rituals left to them. One man whispered the litany of protection before every shift, even though his lips bled from dryness. A woman traced the aquila into the grime on her skin, even though it vanished in sweat. They fought with memory as their only weapon. But the warp is patient. It erodes. It seeps. It gnaws. It does not need sudden conquest. It needs time, and time was all the chains offered. The first signs of surrender were small. A man who no longer flinched when the whispers filled his dreams. A woman who laughed when her skin tore beneath iron, claiming the pain had purpose. Prisoners began to change posture. They stood taller, though their backs were bent. They pulled harder, though their arms were thin. Their eyes stopped looking for escape and instead fixed on the machines themselves, as though the engines were priests and the chains were scripture. Overseers noticed the difference. They did not understand it, but they did not question it. Obedience was obedience, and production rose. What the prisoners worshipped did not matter, so long as they moved. Those who resisted became marked, not by overseers, but by the warp itself. They coughed, blood blacker than soot. Their chains grew heavier, their shackles biting deeper, as though iron hungered more for them than for others. Dreams tormented them, louder, sharper, filled with voices that screamed until their ears rang even when awake. And when they broke, because every chain has a breaking point, they did not die. They changed. Their eyes clouded until no iris remained. Their tongues muttered litanies, in voices not their own. They moved as if guided by unseen hands, their chains rattling not in protest but in rhythm with whispers only they could hear. Resistance had been consumed. Devotion replaced it. There were stories, told in gasps between shifts, of men who embraced the whispers fully. They claimed their chains fell away. They walked into the furnaces unburned. They disappeared into the shadows and returned wearing scars that shone like scripture. No one knew if these tales were truth, hallucination, or threat, but in the iron halls, rumor carried the same weight as reality, and the rumor itself pushed more to listen, more to obey, more to see if their chains might also become wings. The machinery responded. It no longer sounded like mere engines. Its rhythm became chant, metallic and low, reverberating in the ribs of every prisoner. It beat with the cadence of war drums, of sermons, of heartbeats that were not human. Some prisoners swore they saw faces in the steel jaws, wide as if speaking, eyes flickering with oil firelight. They were not saints. They were not angels. They were echoes of something vast, patient, watching, and those who labored beneath them knew their devotion was no longer to overseers, or to the Imperium, or even to themselves. Their chains had taught them the first liturgy of damnation, to serve endlessly, to suffer willingly, to belong not to flesh, not to iron, but to whatever bound the two together. Chains were stronger than wrists. Chains were stronger than names. In the halls of the fallen, chains were stronger than the emperor. The cathedral no longer bore the Aquila. Once its twin-headed eagle had stretched across the high altar, wings gilded, claws sharp as judgment. Now, only scars remained. The stone where it had been carved was broken, gouged, as if by fingernails too large for human hands. Dust collected in the hollows, and the faithful, who still dared to enter, avoided looking upward. They whispered that to raise their eyes was to feel them burn, not from flame, but from shame. And yet, still, they came. The cathedral's doors hung warped on their hinges. Its stained glass shattered, its incense long since replaced by the stink of rust and oil. But when the bell tolled a sound not made by rope, but by unseen force bodies filed inside, as if commanded, the sermons had never stopped. Vox grills embedded in the cracked pillars hissed and warbled with voices that were not priestly. Their tones were low, almost wet, syllables rolling like stones dragged undercurrent. At first, those who listened had thought it distortion, a machine broken, replaying scraps of forgotten but soon, the syllables grew into rhythm. They pressed against skulls, slid into ears, and lingered. The desperate, too starved of meaning to resist, repeated what they heard. Their lips moved with words they did not understand, shaping sounds that felt heavier than language. And with each repetition, the voices grew clearer, as if fed by the mouths that echoed them. What was summoned was not understood. Men chanted until their tongues bled. Women fell to their knees, convulsing, as though their spines bent to the shape of each phrase. Children laughed, their giggles hollow, chanting melodies they could not have learned, melodies too old for memory. It was not worship in the imperial sense. It was hunger, given sound. Words were swallowed, chewed, devoured, and spat back out as something other. Each syllable carried weight enough to bend silence into form, and the more the faithful repeated, the heavier the air became. Breathing inside the cathedral was not like breathing outside. The air here tasted of iron and bitterness, as though every inhalation carried someone else's exhale. A communion not sanctioned but stolen. The priests had fled long ago. Their pulpits were abandoned, their robes shredded into rags by hands that once sought blessing. But in their absence, the sermons did not cease. Figures rose among the desperate, not by title or training, but by how loudly they could echo the syllables that pressed into their skulls. They stood atop broken altars, their arms outstretched, their throats raw, their eyes unblinking. They spoke until blood seeped from their gums, until their voices split. Yet the sound that poured from them did not stop. It layered, doubled, became choruses where there should have been only one voice. The worshippers called them prophets, though none knew what prophecy they served. Their bodies became conduits, and their sermons became storms. Those who resisted fared worse than those who followed. A man who covered his ears found his own hands tearing them open, compelled not by choice but by something that refused to be denied. A woman who refused to chant found her breath halting, lungs swelling as though drowning, until she gasped the words aloud. Resistance was not punished by overseers or mobs. It was punished by the syllables themselves. They demanded voice. They demanded tongue. They demanded that every throat become instrument. And once given, the voice was never truly one's own again. The faithful drowned here, not in Promethean fire, but in songs older than Terra's stones. The hymns of the Imperium had always promised eternity, but these chants delivered it in suffocation. To chant was to lose oneself, to feel identity blur into vibration. Faces slackened, eyes glazed, until a crowd of individuals became a single organism pulsing with rhythm. The songs filled every hollow, every silence, every doubt. They offered unity at the cost of self, clarity at the cost of thought. In the cathedral, no one stood alone, but no one truly stood as themselves either. Strange things began to happen as the chants deepened. Candles relit, though no flame touched them. Cracks in the stone walls closed, not with mortar, but with flesh that pulsed faintly, veins throbbing as if the cathedral itself had become a living body. The shattered statues of saints reformed into twisted effigies, faces half remembered, half invented, their stone lips parting to mouth the same syllables spilling from the congregation. The air shimmered with heat, though no braziers burned. Worshippers spoke of shadows moving without light, of whispers that continued even after the sermons ceased, of dreams that echoed with chants never heard awake. And through it all, the desperate came back. Because as suffocating as the songs were, they offered something the Emperor's silence had not: reply. Every sermon ended the same way. The final syllable would cut through the cathedral like a blade, and for a heartbeat, the air would be utterly still. Not silent, never silent, but still. It was a pause that felt like being held underwater, lungs screaming, heart pounding, and then nothing. When breath finally returned, the worshippers gasped as one, clutching their chests, tears streaking their ash-marked faces. They stumbled back into the streets, their legs shaking, their voices hoarse. Yet even as they staggered, they whispered the syllables under their breath, unable to let them go. The sermons ended in the cathedral, but the chant continued in every alley, every hovel, every throat. Life beyond the doors became extension of the dark liturgy within. Those few who remembered the old sermons, the Emperor's sermons, spoke of a different weight. They said, his litanies had burned like fire, seared doubt into ash, forged unity from obedience. But here, in the cathedral, stripped of his aquila, the weight was not of fire, but of drowning. The syllables did not burn, they smothered. They pressed down until the faithful gasped, not for salvation, but for breath. And once they gasped, they found themselves chanting again, giving voice to a song that had no end, no beginning, only hunger. In time, the cathedral ceased to be a ruin. It became something else. Its walls pulsed with sound, its air thick with vibration, its congregation bound together not by faith but by compulsion. No one remembered when it had begun. No one questioned when it would end. The sermons had become the only constant in a world where ash and chains ruled, and the faithful, desperate as they were, found themselves kneeling not to the Emperor, not to saints, not even to hope. They knelt 2 syllables, 2 hunger-made sound, to the promise that even if their bodies failed, their voices would never stop echoing. The Astronomicon was meant to be constant, a beacon burning from Terra itself, guiding ships through the warp, keeping humanity tethered to order amid madness. For those trained to hear it, its pulse was steady as a heartbeat, a rhythm no storm could erase. But here, in the ash-choked systems, far from Imperial reach, that pulse faltered. Astropaths hunched over, cracked data slates, and trembling quills, straining with bleeding eyes to hold the light steady, only to find it bending. What should have been a pure flame arrived, warped, twisted into shapes that clawed the inside of their skulls. The signal no longer spoke in constancy. It laughed, it wept, it hissed. And when their lips moved to transcribe, the words that spilled onto parchment were not human. The distortions spread slowly at first. One astropath muttered of syllables that broke her teeth as she spoke them. Another saw the Astronomicon's light as colors that no spectrum should hold, bleeding into visions of faces pressed too close against the veil. Reports sent to the administratum were stamped defective, dismissed as weakness, madness, failure of discipline. But the distortions did not stop. They multiplied. More and more scribes found their hands carving runes instead of letters, their ink seeping into patterns that spiraled until they covered whole walls. And though their superiors burned the parchments, the patterns did not vanish. They reappeared in the dust on floors, in the cracks of ceilings, in the blood coughed up by the weakest throats. The message was not dismissed. It was relentless. Among the fallen, what was madness to the Imperium became revelation. They gathered around the broken astropaths, listening as their mouths frothed with words no lexicon contained, Some phrases were screams, others whispers, but all of them carried a rhythm too heavy to ignore. The listeners called it prophecy. They did not hear distortion. They heard destiny. The warp-bent syllables became sermons in their own right, repeated until they lost shape, until they became mantras, and in repetition, the lies hardened into scripture. The faithful scrawled them on their arms, their walls, their children's faces. They carved them into metal, branding them into chains. The Astronomicon had not gone silent, it had changed, and the desperate would rather worship lies than live without voice. Those who clung to reason found themselves crushed beneath the weight of belief. A navigator once renowned for her precision stood before a crowd and begged them not to listen. She spoke of magnetic drift, of psychic storms, of interference in the warp. But as she explained, her voice was drowned by hundreds chanting the distortions back at her, louder and louder, until her words cracked and faltered. They dragged her into the cathedral, forced her mouth open, and pressed the syllables into her throat. She choked, screamed, and finally joined the chorus. Her reason had no weight compared to the hunger of a people starved of certainty. Visions began to spread. The astropaths no longer merely heard the signal. They saw it. In the glow of their sockets, images burned, cities rising from oceans of ash, stars bowing until they cracked, golden thrones made of teeth. They spoke these visions in voices that were not their own, voices layered as though 100 throats spoke through one. And the fallen listened. They built shrines not to saints, but to images seen in delirium. They painted murals with blood and soot, depicting prophecies no one understood, but everyone obeyed. The warp had dressed itself in prophecy, and its garment was heavier than any robe the ecclesiarchy had ever woven. In the manufactorum, production shifted again. Machines began to stamp symbols no engineer remembered designing. Chains bore inscriptions in the new scripture. Girders were etched with prophecies before being lifted into place. The very architecture of survival was recast into liturgy. To walk the halls was to walk through visions frozen into metal. Every surface became text, every wall a hymn, and those who worked among them no longer asked what they were building. They only asked what the prophecy demanded next. The lies were never stable. The Astronomicon's distortion shifted with each passing night. What was gospel one week became blasphemy the next. But the faithful never faltered. They adapted. They rewrote their flesh, carving new runes over old ones, letting scars overlap into tangled scripture. Each contradiction was explained away as revelation too deep to be understood by mortals. Each impossibility was exalted as proof that truth was larger than logic. The weight of belief was not in its clarity, but in its refusal to break. To believe, even when the stars lied, was proof of strength, and strength was survival. Yet beneath the chants and the scars, fear never vanished. Some whispered in corners that, if the Astronomicon had bent, then perhaps Terra itself had fallen. Perhaps the Emperor no longer sat the golden throne. Perhaps his light was gone, and what they worshipped was only the echo of his corpse, twisted by the warp into a cruel joke. These whispers were dangerous, not because they were false, but because they were possible. And possibility was more lethal than certainty. Those caught speaking them were dragged to the altars, their tongues cut, their blood used to anoint the next sermon. In the end, even their silence was folded back into prophecy. Their absence explained as sacrifice demanded by the stars. What remained was a world rewritten. The heavens themselves no longer guided ships, they guided faith. The astropaths, broken and hollowed, became saints of a gospel they did not control. The fallen knelt not to the Emperor's constancy, but to a beacon that shifted, that lied, that suffocated reason beneath its weight. And when they looked upward, when they dared to pierce the ash-clouded skies, they no longer sought Terra's flame. They sought only the next distortion, the next vision, the next command wrapped in falsehood. For them, Lies had become the only scripture left, and in their echoes, the truth was no longer needed. The banquet did not begin with the sound of cutlery or the lifting of lids. It began with silence, the kind that pressed down like weight, suffocating the breath from every throat present. A long table stretched across the hall, cobbled together from broken machinery, rusted plating, and shattered pews. Upon it lay no meat, no bread, no water. Yet those who gathered sat with trembling hands, eyes wide, mouths already wet as if they had smelled roast and wine. Hunger was no longer for flesh. Hunger was for remembrance. What they craved was not food, it was memory. The first to eat was always chosen, though never by vote or lot. Some force unseen singled them out, and when they stood, the others leaned forward in anticipation. The chosen one placed hands upon the table, palms flat against cold metal. Their eyes closed, and their lips began to tremble. At first, the sound was faint, a half-forgotten name whispered into the air. But as the ritual deepened, their voice grew louder, words spilling out in a flood, names no one else remembered, mothers, comrades, oaths, spoken long ago. They poured from the mouth like wine from a broken vessel, until the chosen's body shook with exhaustion. And when they could speak no more, the others devoured it not with teeth, but with memory. They leaned close, drinking the words, pulling them into their own minds until the speaker collapsed, emptied, hollow. What they received in return was not nourishment in any mortal sense. No belly was filled. No strength returned to limbs. Instead, visions bloomed behind their eyes, creatures, wrought of bone and flame. Beasts whose ribs flared like wings, whose jaws gnashed in silence. They saw cities cracking open like eggs, their people spilling into the void. They saw rivers of molten glass, oceans of ash, skies crawling with shapes that never fully resolved. To consume a memory was to gain a fragment of a vision, and to carry that vision was to surrender a piece of the self. For each name swallowed, one of their own names slipped away. One by one, those gathered became strangers to themselves. Children took their first share with eagerness, voices bright, faces innocent. But as their lips shaped words they did not understand, their parents' names slipped from their minds. Soon they no longer recognized the hands that had carried them, the faces that had wept for them. They looked into their mother's eyes and saw only blankness, saw only a fellow guest at the table. Parents screamed when their children forgot them, but the screams faded into chants. Because to keep the ritual alive was worth more than the bonds of blood. And so the feast continued, each round stripping another tie, each repetition unraveling another thread of the self. There were those who resisted, who clamped their jaws shut, who pressed their backs against the wall and refused to drink. But hunger gnawed at memory as much as it gnawed at flesh. Those who did not partake soon forgot anyway, not by choice, but by subtraction. They would wake one morning, unable to recall the face of their own reflection, their own name slipping like smoke through grasping fingers. They wandered the halls muttering nonsense, hollow-eyed, until they were dragged back to the table and forced to eat. Resistance bought nothing but delay. The ritual deepened with time. No longer did the guests wait for the chosen to collapse. They lunged, desperate, devouring names, mid-breath tearing memory apart as it was spoken. Faces blurred faster, oaths vanished quicker, until even the act of chanting became a frenzy. They clawed at each other's throats to pull words free. They scraped nails against flesh to draw out syllables written beneath the skin. Some tore chunks of hair, teeth, or nails, believing memory hid within the body itself. They consumed not only words but flesh, not out of hunger for meat, but in the belief that somewhere inside, a name still lingered. And when they swallowed, their eyes widened with visions, more bone, more flame, more impossible geometries carved into the fabric of their minds. What they built in, their frenzy was not community, but a graveyard of identities. Entire families forgot they had ever been kin. Comrades who had fought side by side no longer recognized each other's faces. Leaders rose and fell in the span of a single feast, exalted in memory one moment, forgotten as soon as their names were consumed. The only constant was the table, the only permanence, the hunger that bound them all. To live was not to breathe or to eat. To live was to be remembered, and to be remembered was to be consumed. Some claimed to see the truth of it. They spoke, before their own voices were swallowed, of beings that fed not on flesh, but on memory itself. They said the feast was not theirs. It was offering to something far larger, something that lingered beyond the veil. Perhaps gods, perhaps ghosts, perhaps only the warp itself, drunk on the taste of human identity. But none could be sure, for each who spoke such words was soon emptied, their names devoured, their eyes glassy and blank. Their prophecy became just another course at the banquet, swallowed with as little hesitation as the rest. The visions grew sharper, heavier. Guests staggered from the hall, unable to tell whether they had lived their own lives or stolen the fragments of others. A man swore he had once been a sister of battle, her armor bright, her faith unyielding. A woman screamed that she had fought as a guardsman on Cadia, though her hands bore no scars of war. A child laughed as he declared himself a saint, though his teeth were broken, his eyes wide and hollow. Identities mixed, swapped, dissolved, until the line between memory and hallucination was gone. They were all, everyone. There was no one by the time the banquet ended. The hall was filled with corpses not dead, but hollow. Men and women sat upright, eyes vacant, lips moving in silence. They had forgotten even the act of eating, forgotten that they had gathered, forgotten what hunger had driven them here. And yet, the table remained. New guests would come, drawn by whispers of sustenance, of remembrance, of visions that promised truth. They would sit, trembling, eager, and the feast would begin again. In these halls, life was no longer measured in years, or deeds, or victories. Life was measured in names, and every name was destined to be devoured, until the table stretched, not across the hall, but across eternity itself. A banquet of forgotten souls, offered to the dark, where nothing is remembered except a hunger that consumes. There was no war, not in the sense that wars have beginnings, causes, or declarations. No demands were made. No territory was claimed. No orders barked through vox. The march simply began without trumpet or signal flare, and it has not ended since. Across ash plains and drowned hive cities, through ruined manufactura and once blessed basilica, they moved. Columns of warriors armored in rusted plates and blood-stained hides. Their banners were not colors but bones. Their chants were not oaths but howls. Each footfall struck with the weight of memory, too heavy to bear. They marched not toward victory, but into the act of marching itself, until the world beneath them forgot stillness. They bore weapons, though not all could be called such. Some carried chains welded into loops of teeth. Others dragged iron slabs behind them, grinding sparks into the dirt. A few walked unarmed, their hands mangled into claws by time or ritual. None spoke. The noise came from the earth, a trembling rhythm, a thunder of feet, unbroken for years. The ground cracked beneath their weight. Roads split open. Riverbeds ran dry. Cities that once gleamed fell into silence before the first warrior arrived, already emptied by dread. As if the very air knew what approached, these warriors did not occupy. They did not rebuild. They passed through like plague. What they did not destroy by blade, they ruined by presence. Each world left behind bore scars deeper than conquest. The skies turned red weeks after they had passed. Crops withered. Machines stopped responding to command. Vox traffic dissolved into static that moaned with syllables no tech priest dared decode. Children born in the wake of the march never cried. Their lungs filled, but the sound that escaped was closer to chant than weep. 1,000 war bands might burn a planet, but The march burned the memory of it. Maps redrew themselves. Names faded from records. It was not just annihilation. It was erasure. None who joined the march could say when they had started. They did not recall pledging allegiance, receiving orders, or choosing a path. They only remembered walking. Most had forgotten their names. A few still whispered theirs under breath, like curses, as if trying to bury them before something else did. Their armor bore no sigils. Their flesh bore many. Scars shaped like eyes, spirals etched into bone, brands that glowed faintly when moons rose. Some still looked human, others did not. Limbs had twisted, jaws elongated, skin split into scales or plates. But the changes did not mark them as monsters. They marked them as survivors. Each deformity was a chapter of endurance. Each mutation, a hymn of passage. The march did not tolerate stillness. Those who faltered were trampled, not with malice, but with indifference. The rhythm could not break for one man's weakness. There were no healers, no rest, no flank. It was not an army. It was momentum made flesh. Even when sleep took them, their feet moved. Even when blood loss turned vision black, their knees pushed forward. Entire continents were crossed by warriors already dead, their bodies puppeted by rhythm alone. They would fall only when the ground beneath them didn't. Even then, they would crawl. It was said among the scattered who witnessed the march that the warriors did not age, that decades passed with no gray in their hair, no sag in their shoulders. Some believed the warp preserved them. Others whispered they were already dead, that they marched not in life, but in penance. Whatever the truth, time did not soften them, it sharpened. Each year seemed to strip more from their humanity. Their words disappeared first, then their memories, then their faces lost behind helms, or growths, or rust, until finally, only the gate remained less, unbroken, absolute. None led them. There was no general, no prophet, and yet, they moved with unity. No one strayed. No one turned. When they crossed oceans, they marched into the surf without pause. When they met mountains, they climbed without equipment. When they met defenders, they slaughtered without formation. Resistance was always brief. The enemy never understood the nature of what approached. They expected strategy, but the march did not fight as an army. It fought as weather, as tide. It overwhelmed. A wall of bodies that did not hesitate, did not fear, did not stop. Even when broken, even when burning, even when screaming with exposed nerves, they advanced. Those who survived their path carried marks. A guardsman who fled from one such encounter gouged his eyes out, a week later, whispering that the eyes of the marchers were already inside him. A priest captured and questioned after refusing to abandon his shrine spoke of hearing footfalls for hours before they arrived, each beat louder than his prayers. When asked what banner they bore, he laughed until his lungs bled and said, "They march under nothing. That's why they can't be stopped." Inquisitors who studied these reports often destroyed them. Not from disbelief, from fear of recognition. For what these warriors marched toward was not physical. It was contagious. It became clear to some that the march recruited as it went not by word, but by rhythm. A man watching from the hills might feel his heartbeat stutter, then fall into time with the footfalls. A child might begin pacing in circles, faster, tighter, until he collapsed in exhaustion. And when he arose, he walked away from his family without a word. Joining the column days later, his face blank and his pace perfect. This was not conscription. This was conversion. To witness the march was to risk joining it. And so, entire regions forbade even speaking of it aloud. But silence does not erase footsteps. And the ground remembered. The march did not follow warp lanes. It did not obey seasons. It crossed radiation zones, Xenos ruins, ghost sectors. Every terrain became level beneath its advance. It was as if the galaxy itself bent to accommodate. No one knew if they had a destination, or if the destination was the march itself. What mattered was motion. What mattered was not stopping. And so, they moved, not in conquest, not in retreat, but in devotion to inertia, to blood, to rhythm so old it may have been the first sound the galaxy ever heard. Some whisper that if the march ever reaches its end, the ground will split open, and from it pour, not victory, but memory of every name lost, every oath broken, every face forgotten by the Imperium, that when the final step lands, it will not be upon soil, but upon the edge of reality itself, and that the foot which falls will not rise again, because what lies beyond the end of the march is not silence. It is what made the march begin. The first note never came from a throat. It rang from the metal walls themselves, a low vibration, too deep to be heard, only felt. At first, the living dismissed it as fault-line tremor, manufacturum stress, tectonic bleed. But then it began to harmonize, not with machinery, not with alarms, but with breathing, a resonance that curved into the lungs of all who heard it. You did not listen to the choir. It listened to you, and once it had found your voice, it did not let go. Those who lived nearest the collapsed shrines were the first to fall into rhythm. They did not speak. They did not pray. They simply stood in rows, backs bent, chests heaving in precise cadence. Some had no mouths. Some had no faces. Others bore wounds, long-thought fatal lungs shredded by shrapnel, vocal cords severed by chain blades, necks split to the spine. Yet from all of them came the sound, low, unbroken, wet with breath, yet untouched by will. It poured like oil down the corridors, pooling in corners, coating air with something heavier than smoke. There were no lyrics. The hymn carried no words. It surged in vowel-shaped waves, impossible to replicate, impossible to ignore. It reverberated across metal and stone, vibrating deep into teeth, into marrow. To hear it was to feel your own thoughts smothered. Logic bled out of the mind. Names slipped. Memories blurred. You could not think in its presence, only feel, and what you felt was hunger, grief, all wrapped in the texture of despair. Some clawed their ears until they bled. Others tore their own tongues free, believing silence would grant escape. It did not. The hollowed did not die. They did not rot. They stood where they were placed, as if arranged by unseen hands. Sometimes they moved, but only to adjust harmony. If a wall crumbled, or a wind tunnel bent the tone, they shifted, rotating their broken torsos, or swinging headless necks, until the pitch realigned. Observers quickly realized they were not the source of the music. They were instruments. The warp played them like pipes of flesh. Their skin stretched tight, bones acting as tuning forks, cavities reshaped for better acoustics. It was not possession, it was orchestration. To enter the radius of the choir was to step into another medium. Sound did not travel, hear it, lived. It thickened around the ankles like syrup, rose into the throat like steam, pressed against the eyeballs until vision swam. Even whispering became impossible. Your voice would either be absorbed or warped, folded into the melody like a dissonant string. Some claimed to see color within the song, synesthetic bursts of violet and rust that curled through the air like incense. Others swore they felt memories pulled from their skulls, dragged screaming through their ears, and dispersed into the hymn itself. That priests who tried to sanctify the hallowed met disaster. One brought incense, another blessed oils. Both wept blood within minutes. The hymn did not repel them, it consumed them. Their litanies were mocked, reflected back in reversed syllables. Their prayers sung out of their own mouths by the hallowed before they could finish them. A cardinal detonated in the middle of anointing, his flesh bursting into flayed chords that screamed in 4 harmonies at once, before twisting into silence. After that, the ecclesiarchy forbade further missions. No more relics, no more rites. The choir was to be left unchallenged, but the people did not obey. Pilgrims came, driven not by doctrine, but by despair. They crawled across glass plains and chemical wastes to kneel in the presence of the sound. Many simply sat, rocking slowly, their eyes fogged, their minds erased. Others joined the choir, walking calmly into its ranks, removing their tongues, carving out their own lungs, exposing their chests so the sound could nest deeper. They were not mourned. They had become part of something larger. Their absence in memory was swift, clean as if they had never existed apart from the sound. Skittery units deployed for observation found their augmetics screaming. Audio receptors melted from inside. Targeting lenses fractured with invisible force. One Magos attempted to sample the frequency directly. Her servo skull imploded. Her ears followed. In her final moments, she reported the sound contained recursion phrases layered within phrases. Hymns nested like predatory shells. Each note contained another choir, another world of voices, a fractal temple that stretched inward forever. Before her systems collapsed, she transmitted one phrase: "The music is hollow because it waits to be filled." Whispers spread that the choir was not merely artifice of chaos, but a liturgical weapon, a resonance engineered to erase thought, unwrite language, dissolve command. It needed no fleet, no invasion. It simply needed listeners. In one recorded incident, a minor Forge World's command hierarchy collapsed in under 2 hours after receiving a short vox pulse recorded from the Hallowed. Officers forgot their own security protocols. Binary communication dissolved into static and moan. Entire data chains infected. Orders reversed. Silence spread not from power failure but from the music's completion. The hymn had played through the machine minds, and in doing so, had taught them to unspeak. And still, the Hallowed sang. No one could recall how many there were. Their numbers shifted, sometimes a dozen, sometimes hundreds. They emerged from walls. They stood in chambers once sealed for centuries. They grew from floors like stalagmites of bone and lung, always in perfect formation, always in harmony. No one built them. No one commanded them. But they responded to silence like bacteria, to warmth multiplying, thickening, enclosing. Some claimed they could be directed, that if one entered the choir's core and surrendered fully, one could steer the song, that a single will, drowned and reborn, could weaponize resonance itself. No one returned from such experiments intact. To live within range of the Hallowed was to lose the ability to hear silence. Even when distance offered escape, the song lingered in bones, echoing within the ribcage, rising when breath slowed. Sleep offered no refuge. Dreams sang back. Voices once known began humming distorted versions of themselves, and entire families were driven mad trying to find the moment there. Loved one's voice had changed. The Hallowed did not seek converts. They did not grow by persuasion. They grew by proximity. The warp had found a perfect method to propagate, not by strength, but by vibration. A hymn that made worship irrelevant, that devoured thought and replaced it with harmony. Where the Imperium demanded belief, the choir demanded resonance, and resonance, once found, never left. It began in whispers, as most things do, when the warp brushes the edge of flesh. A discolored vein beneath the skin, a fingertip that split at the center and grew a second nail, hair that did not fall, but coiled around the scalp like vines with purpose. At first, these changes were denied. The fallen called them injuries, infections, mistakes. They bound the limbs, cauterized the sores, hid the shifting eyes behind cloth. But the flesh remembered, the flesh insisted. And soon, it began to speak louder. No one transformed all at once. That was the lie told in the old sermons, that corruption arrived as a wave, a moment, a flash of mutation, punished by fire. But here, among the fallen, change was not a scream, it was a murmur. a foot that no longer made prints, a voice that echoed from beneath the tongue, a spine that clicked, not with pain, but with potential. One day, you woke up unable to wear your boots. The next, your ribs flared into protrusions that caught on cloth. No one asked why. They simply cut the fabric and kept walking. To the Imperium. Flesh is a vessel. Unremarkable. Uniform. Expendable. It holds duty and is discarded when duty ends. But among the fallen, flesh became scripture. Every twist, every rupture, every unfurling was a verse written not in ink, but in muscle and bone. Those who grew wings were not seen as gifted. They were seen as chosen to fly above the others and carry the scent of faith to the stars. Those who sprouted claws were not warriors, but scribes meant to carve liturgy into steel and skin alike. Those who dissolved into liquid hunger were not punished. They were praised for finally discarding the prison of bone altogether. There were patterns, but no symmetry. The gifts came from elsewhere, and they came with intent, but not with consistency. One man's tongue split into three and hissed prophecy for days before falling silent forever. Another woman's skin grew luminous, so bright that she was buried in earth to prevent blindness in those around her. When unearthed weeks later, she had no mouth, no eyes, no fingers, only light, pulsing faintly, beating like a second heart beneath translucent skin. They called her a saint. She said nothing. She no longer could. The fallen stopped calling themselves human, not from shame, but from accuracy. Humanity was a shape, a cage, a term designed for something smaller. Their bodies had outgrown the lexicon. One wore a face that stretched the width of his shoulders. Eyes ringed around the jaw, mouth resting where the chest once was. He ate nothing but sound. Another grew smaller, her bones folding inward until she could nest inside the chest cavity of a corpse, where she claimed the visions were clearer. She spoke from the inside of the dead, her voice muffled, wet, but always precise. Imperial measurements no longer mattered. Rank, height, weight none applied. What mattered now was proximity. How close you stood to your patron. How clearly you heard their hunger in your blood. Some grew antlers, some sprouted mandibles, others bled ink when spoken to. All of them adjusted their posture, their gait, their thoughts, to the rhythm of what the warp desired. A man who once served as an officer of the Astra Militarum fell to his knees, not out of penance, but because his legs had twisted backward, bending like a beast. When he stood again, he was faster, his spine arched like a bow pulled taut. He did not mourn. He led the next charge. There were those whose mutations seemed too vast, too chaotic. They bloated, burst, reformed. They moved like unfinished thoughts, their shapes shifting mid-step, as if the very idea of their form was still being debated. These were feared, not because they were dangerous, but because they reflected the truth too clearly. That flesh was not final. That identity was not stable. That all things, given time and exposure, become unrecognizable to themselves. And in that recognition, there was power. The marks of transformation were not always visible. Some bore inner changes that revealed themselves only in silence. One man could walk through fire unburned, but flinched at the sound of prayers. Another cast no shadow. One woman laughed once and was never heard again, not because she was mute, but because every laugh had been spent in that single burst. Her lungs moved, her mouth opened, but no sound came. She had laughed herself empty. There were rituals, not of initiation, but of acceptance. Each change was marked by offerings of blood, of memory, of silence. A child whose spine had sprouted thorns was held aloft, their back shaved with iron razors. The blood caught in bowls and mixed into paint for the cathedral walls. A man whose jaw unhinged until it hung at his chest was tasked with consuming sacred texts. Each page swallowed until scripture lived not on shelves, but in stomachs. Another woman's skin turned to glass. She was shattered and scattered across the camp, her fragments placed in the mouths of those who had not yet changed, so that her voice would live in all of them. To the Imperium, such acts would be heresy beyond reckoning, but among the fallen, heresy had no meaning. It had no opposite. There was only distance from the warp, and the long, slow crawl toward it. Every deformity was a bridge, every rupture a door. The closer one came to the patron's shape, whatever that was, the closer one came to meaning, and yet, not all sought the same path. Some twisted in ways that others found abhorrent, flesh that crawled, eyes that blinked from palms, teeth that grew outward, curling along the cheeks like mocking smiles. There were fights not for purity, but for hierarchy, whose form pleased the unseen most, whose shape was truest to the hunger that birthed them. These wars were not of words, but of biology. Limbs torn, organs exchanged, blood spilled, not in anger, but in competition. And when the fighting ended, the victors bore new marks, scars shaped like questions, wounds that would never close, because the warp was still watching. In the end, there were no mirrors. No one wanted to see what remained. They wore veils not to hide, but because the face was no longer the source of identity. The face had nothing left to offer. It was the body that spoke now. It sang in twitch and twist, in bloom and rupture. Flesh became voice, became weapon, became banner. It became the truth. The city grew without hands. One day, there was ash. The next, there were foundations, black stones sweating from the earth. Shapes not quarried, not poured, but birthed. Columns rose like twisted bones thrust through skin, their surfaces slick, as if still wet from emergence. Walls stretched sideways before rising, angles folding and collapsing, not with planning but with hunger. Nothing aligned. Doors opened into voids. Windows faced blank stone. Bridges crossed nothing, then curled upward into spirals that led into sky and never returned. It was not architecture. It was extrusion. The city did not rise by design. It was willed into being, one impossible spire at a time. The first to enter called it a miracle. They spoke of the breathless awe as streets unfolded beneath their feet. No hammer, no flame, no scaffolding. Just stone that pulsed and opened, inviting them forward like a heartbeat. But Al turned to dread within days. Buildings grew over their camps, swallowing tents and watch. A tower rose through a barracks, as if the walls were never there, embedding itself in flesh and wood alike. Survivors staggered from the stone, bleeding, dazed but alive. The city did not kill, it repurposed. A man who once guarded a supply chain found his arm fused into a wall, fingers spread like torch brackets. A woman who led the scout patrols now formed the base of a stairwell, her spine arching perfectly with each step. They lived. They screamed. The city did not stop. No prayers were offered here. No bells rang for the emperor. The spires bore no aquila, no sigil of terra. They twisted upward like accusations, curling and branching like antlers of a god that had never been named. And at their peaks, nothing. No altar, no light. Just void, thin and yawning. A silence so deep it bent the air. Yet still the structures rose. Each night brought new towers. Each tower birthed new halls. The expansion was endless, and it was precise. Every brick placed with purpose. Every stair angled to catch some unseen gaze. The workers stopped asking what they were building. They understood now. It was not a city for them. It was a shrine, a vessel for something that watched, not from orbit, but from beyond. The laborers changed, not in flesh, not at first, but in posture, in silence, in gaze. They did not speak as they worked. They did not rest. They moved with a rhythm too exact to be human. Their eyes tracked things not present. Their hands shaped stone not with tools, but with gestures. One man waved his fingers in the air, and a pillar bent. A woman tilted her head, and the ceiling curved to match the line of her spine. They were not architects. They were brushes. The city painted itself through them, and each day more were taken, not with chains or blades, but with invitation, a whisper in the ear, a warmth in the spine. And then they joined the rhythm, their steps perfectly in time, their mouths sealed shut by purpose alone. Those who refused to build were folded into the city anyway, not killed, never killed. One man fled into the desert. Days later, he was found as part of a bench's skin stretched across the surface, his ribs visible just beneath, his heartbeat faint but steady. Another woman hid beneath an altar and woke embedded in a mural, her face painted into the stone, her eyes still blinking. The city did not punish, it absorbed. Resistance was not met with violence, it was met with utility. Everything could serve, and everything did. No one issued commands. There were no foremen, no overseers, no planning tablets or tactical slates. Yet every angle aligned with some deeper symmetry. From above, the layout resembled nothing familiar, no grid, no radial spread, no imperial form, but it pulsed. Drones sent to map the spires returned scrambled. Images showed not cityscape, but nerve tissue, not rooftops, but veins. One Adeptus Mechanicus adept compared the layout to a brain. Another said it resembled the interior of a seed. Neither survived the night. Their blood was later found, tracing new walls, words written in arterial script. The city had read them, and now it remembered. The deeper into the city one walked, the stranger the rules became. Gravity loosened, floors curved sideways, sound echoed before it was made. Shadows drifted in opposition to light. Entire chambers inverted mid-step, walls becoming floors, stairs becoming teeth. Logic failed, maps decayed. Men entered corridors and returned aged, mutated. Speaking of halls filled with inverted suns and doorways that led into screams. Yet even these anomalies had pattern. Even chaos obeyed the city's design. It was not broken, it was beyond function. Built not for mortals, built for eyes that did not blink, for minds that saw time as a shape, not a line. And still, the workers marched. They did not eat. They did not sleep. They wore no armor, no robes, no sigils. Their bodies were draped in dust, in dried mortar, in blood not their own. And as they worked, they hummed not music, but vibration, like insects flexing inside a skull. The city echoed that hum. It pulsed in reply, call and response, builder and built. Every stone laid was an answer to a question no one had asked. Every spire raised was a declaration in a language made of silence. Some claimed the city was listening, that when you spoke aloud, the walls leaned closer, that if you screamed, a window would open and not close again. That prayers offered in desperation were answered not with salvation, but with architecture. A plea for escape might be met with a stairwell that spiraled for days and never descended. A whisper of grief might summon a chamber where gravity wept upward, pulling tears from eyes until they drifted in air like stars. It gave what was asked, but it never gave what was wanted. Eventually, the builders stopped dying. Wounds no longer bled, breath no longer steamed. They moved like clockwork, their joints cracking with dust, their eyes blank and wet. They were not corpses. They were not alive. They were something between a mortar of flesh and memory, holding up the dream of a thing not yet arrived. The city did not mourn them. It wore them. Above all, the tallest tower never stopped growing. Its shadow reached across mountains, across time. It could be seen from orbit, a needle piercing the firmament, but its top was never visible. Clouds curled around it. Stars blinked near it. Uspex readings failed, and those who tried to ascend it vanished. No fall, no scream, just a step, and then absence. Perhaps the tower led upward. Perhaps it curled inward. Perhaps it had never pointed to the sky at all, but to something beneath the ground, something too large to emerge, and the city was only its eye. The workers still build, the city still grows, and the gods it honors remain unnamed, but they are watching. Every brick laid is a prayer, every spire risen is a scream, and one day, when the last stone finds its place, the city will open not to welcome, but to end. At first they thought it was just fatigue, long shifts under rusted skies, hunger gnawing into bone, screams echoing from cathedrals that had forgotten silence. Madness always came eventually, and dreams, they believed, were the mind's last rebellion, a way to slip beyond the ash and the iron, even for a moment, a mercy. But mercy does not persist in places where the warp thickens. It mutates. It watches, and then it opens its mouth. It began with flickers, people muttering in their sleep, not in their own voices, but in dialects never taught. Men waking with dirt beneath their nails, though they'd never left their quarters. Women sobbing over injuries they didn't have, clutching phantom wounds until real blood followed. The dreams were not dreams. They were incursions full. Sensory invasions where the rules of flesh and thought dissolved. One man described watching his own spine slither away from his back while he begged it to stop. Another recounted walking a corridor made of infant teeth, each step whispering the names of those he had forgotten. These were not nightmares. They were locations, real as steel, and they did not end when the eyes opened. Sleep no longer marked distance from reality. The division frayed. Those who closed their eyes awoke inside the dreams again, sometimes seconds after sleeping, sometimes days later. Time was elastic. There an hour of sleep stretched into centuries of screaming, or collapsed into flashes of 100 dying suns. And even in waking, the images clung. Walls seemed to breathe. Air grew thick with humming that never matched any machine. Shadows bent toward those who tried to rest, curling at their feet like vines waiting to pull. Memory lost cohesion. The dream stained thought. People tried to adapt. Some stopped sleeping entirely. They drank chemical slurries, burned incense made from brainstem dust, injected mixtures sanctioned only on the darkest forge worlds. But the dreams waited. Sleep deprivation didn't prevent them, it simply made the entry more violent. A man awake for 11 days elapsed mid-sentence, his mouth frozen open, eyes wide and pulsing with blood. He screamed for 9 minutes without breath, describing a burning cathedral where the screams of children were used to keep candles lit. When he finally stopped, he wept not in terror, but in grief, because part of him had never returned. They built dreamless zones, sanctuaries of noise and light where nothing could settle. Screaming generators, strobe patterns, overlapping vox loops. Sleep was impossible, but so was rest. Sanity frayed in those rooms faster than in the dreams. Men bit their fingers to the bone just to feel awake. Women tore pages from old sermons and shoved them into their mouths to quiet the static growing behind their teeth. It wasn't that they feared sleep. It was that they feared how easily they now belonged to what waited behind their eyelids. The dreams were no longer visitors. They were residents. The fallen began to mark themselves, not with words, not with scripture, but with sigils drawn in the air just before sleep. Patterns traced with trembling fingers above their own chests, as if warding off something already inside. Some patterns shimmered and vanished. Others lingered, etched into the skin as brands. These sigils did nothing to protect, but belief mattered more than result. Belief made the descent easier. It gave shape to the drowning. Dreams were no longer personal. Entire groups began to report shared experiences, visions that overlapped in detail down to scent, temperature, sound. 1,000 sleepers dreaming the same war. 100 children watching the same figure peel the sky open and crawl through. They awoke with identical phrases carved into their arms. They did not remember doing it. nor did they remember what the phrases meant, but those who read them aloud found their voices pulled from their throats, words echoing hours after mouths had stopped moving. The dreams were sinking, the boundaries between minds eroding, a choir forming one of memory, of fear, of exposure. Some began to fall asleep standing, mid-step, mid-conversation, not out of exhaustion, but because the dreams demanded it. A man paused while hauling scrap and simply froze. His eyes turned inward, his jaw trembled. When he woke, he wept blood and called his own name as if hearing it for the first time. Another collapsed during a prayer and levitated a meter above the ground for 27 seconds, his body convulsing in time with a sound no one else could hear. When he landed, his ribs were cracked from the inside. The dreams began to teach, not with clarity, but with repetition. Symbols appeared again and again, spirals, open eyes, gates with too many hinges. A few dreamers began to draw. They covered walls with the same diagrams, machines that harvested memory, vessels built from teeth, bridges made from repetition. None of it made sense, and yet, when others walked past, they felt recognition deep and unearned, as if the images had always existed inside them. The dreams were not telling stories. They were installing structures, blueprints for a reality not yet born. And some began to follow. They called themselves people who no longer distinguished dream from waking, who walked into the machines they drew and vanished, who built shrines from ash and spit and named them after images seen behind their eyes. They stopped responding to their own names. They answered only two terms, never spoken aloud. They did not fear the dreams. They sought them. They prayed for sleep, and when they lay down, they smiled. The others watched, terrified, for every waker was proof that the self was porous, that there was no inside untouched by dream. That sleep was not a place you went, but a place that came to claim you, inch by inch, until even your waking breath tasted like someone else's memory. The fall did not happen all at once. It was slow, meticulous, elegant, and in time. Those who survived learned the truth. You do not dream in these places, you are dreamed. They had long since stopped counting the battles. There were no dates, no declarations, no banners to fall. Just the ringing of steel against steel until the steel no longer rang. Blades dulled, axes split, chainswords sputtered and screamed, their teeth caught in bone too thick to break, guns jammed, overheated, warped, bolters twisted in their wielder's grip, barrels curling like melted fingers. In any other war, these would have been signs of defeat. But the fallen did not retreat. When the last edge snapped, they raised the hilt. When the last round fired, they threw the casing. When all that remained was bone, they shattered it and carved ruin with the shards. In the absence of weapons, they became weapons. It was not desperation that drove them. It was liturgy. The snapping of a blade was not a failure, it was a beginning. The moment of fracture marked the shift from war to ritual. A full weapon could kill, but a broken one could sanctify. The jagged edge did not strike it inscribed. Flesh became parchment. Armor became altar. Every cut was a verse. Every gouge, a line in scripture. They did not fight to end their enemies. They fought to carve meaning into them. They called it the liturgy of fracture. The first strike, always diagonal, drawn from shoulder to hip. The second, a hook across the back. The third, a downward blow into the thigh. Patterns repeated with holy precision, even under fire, even while bleeding, even while dying. They did not scream as they struck. They chanted, not words, sounds, syllables without translation to raw, too old, too thick with saliva and spite to ever be written. These were not tactics, they were offerings. The battlefield became a sanctuary, and every corpse a relic. Some warriors painted their broken weapons with blood, others with ash. Some fused them with bone, with tooth, with the handles of their fallen comrades. A man who lost both arms lashed blades to his shoulders and charged headfirst into the fray, using his neck to guide the cuts. Another fashioned a flail from his own shattered femur, wielding it like a censer, the marrow flinging blood across every impact site. They were not improvising. They were preaching. Every strike told a story of what remained when nothing whole survived. To kill with a broken weapon required more than strength. It required hatred refined into technique. Every motion was deliberate. Every blow an act of spite, honed so finely it no longer needed explanation. The Imperium had trained its soldiers in efficiency. The Fallen trained in message. A guardsman would shoot to silence. The Fallen carved to remind. One squad tore through an enemy bunker without slaying a single target outright. They maimed, they mutilated, they marked. And when reinforcements arrived, they found a corridor of screaming survivors. Each branded with identical gashes, each cut shaped into a crude symbol of something not meant to be spoken. The walls wept, the air thickened, and none who witnessed the scene could draw their weapons. They dropped them, and ran. Armor offered no protection. A broken blade did not glance. It sank, it hooked. It found seams and joints, wriggled into exposed wire and nerve. Against precision-forged ceramite, it was useless. But against flesh and the will that held the armor up, it was devastating. Because broken weapons carried more than sharpness. They carried intent, and intent, in the hands of the Fallen, had weight no forge could measure. The enemy began to adapt. They reinforced their lines, brought in fresh steel, new pattern weapons, blessed munitions, but nothing held. Because the Fallen did not need victory. They needed wounds, and wounds were easy to find. A squad armed only with splintered iron teeth broke through 3 lines of defense by sheer refusal to stop. They left no survivors. Not because they slaughtered all, but because no one wanted to survive the message written into their skin. Some said the weapons themselves remembered, that once broken, once baptized in hatred, they never dulled again. A shard of a rusted sword, buried in a sergeant's gut, was pulled free days later, still sharp, still wet, still humming. They forged new relics from these remnants. Not polished, not retooled, just bound together fragments into clubs, razors into chains. The resulting weapons were hideous, unwieldy, and utterly sacred. They could not be aimed, only unleashed. And when they struck, the screams they drew out did not stop at the throat. They reached backward, into memory. Some enemies dropped before the blade even touched them, sobbing, remembering wounds not yet received. Even among the Fallen, there were variations. Some warriors fought in silence, eyes closed, carving sigils into flesh as though in trance. Others howled with each strike, voice breaking, spraying spit and blood as they swung. Some groups fought with synchronization, their chants rising into harmonies that made the air crack. Others fought alone, isolated prophets of fracture, dragging their broken weapons behind them like chains of office. But all agreed on one truth: nothing whole was holy. There were those who refused to break their weapons. They called them relics, heirlooms, sacred tools from older battles. They fought with pride. They died fast, because the warp-fed rituals of the broken could not be answered by craftsmanship. They could only be answered by transformation, and the broken transform. With each blow, with each spray of gore, the weapon changed. Edges shifted, handles coiled. The shard remembered, and it grew not in size, but in hunger. Warriors reported, feeling their weapons guide their hands, draw them forward, demand more. They obeyed, not out of fear, but out of faith. What remained on the field after such battles could not be called aftermath. It was art, bodies shaped into glyphs, armor peeled into scripture, bones stacked into punctuation. The enemy no longer feared death. They feared the sentence written across them. One officer, captured alive, begged for execution not because he feared pain, but because he feared being left behind as a message. In the end, The fallen carried fewer weapons. They didn't need many. One blade, broken in the right place, told more truth than 1,000 blessed rounds. They fought not to win, not to conquer, but to declare that even without the Emperor, even without order, even without purpose, they would still speak, through ruin, through rhythm, through blades that did not shatter, but began when they broke. They arrived without banners. No drums, no war cries, no voxcasts screaming allegiance, just the weight of their presence, pressing outward like gravity, distorting sound itself. Wind faltered as they passed. Dust refused to rise. Even the metallic groan of derelict ruins held its breath. It was not stealth, it was subtraction. The pact had entered the field. The first to see them thought their comms had failed. A patrol along the spine of a broken hab block attempted to raise HQ sealant. No static, no interference, just nothing. They moved to investigate, climbing to higher ground, until they saw the figures advancing across the plain. Rank after rank of warriors encased in armor so scorched it no longer bore sigil or seal. Mouths sewn shut with wire, some rusted, others fresh, still weeping blood. Helmets fused closed, vox grills warped into cages. Not one sound escaped them, not one step made echo. The patrol leader attempted a retreat order. No one moved, their ears filled with pressure, their thoughts slowed. By the time the order formed fully in her throat, her squad was already kneeling weaponless, eyes wide, mouths open. No breath passed their lips. They were listening, and the pact had not spoken. Silence in the Imperium is a rarity. Even in death, the machine prayers murmur. Even in void, vox signals pulse with catechism and code. The Imperium is built on noise, commands, chants, alerts, warning, sirens, invocations, liturgies, executions, affirmations. To serve is to obey, and obedience is broadcast. But the pact rejected all of it. They struck from absence, and in doing so, they made absence holy. No one knows where they first formed. Some say a legion disavowed, punished not with death but with mute servitude, cast into the warp with orders never to speak again. Others claim they are remnants of a ritual gone wrong, warriors who heard something they were not meant to survive and sealed their own mouths in penance. Whatever the truth, they now move as a single body, a warband made not of oaths, but of unspoken covenant. The pact does not recruit. There are no rituals, no offerings, no sermons, but still, they grow. Some say it is proximity, that to fight beside them, to witness their purity of silence, is to feel the noise within oneself become unbearable, that the only cure is surrender. Others claim the warp itself favors them, blessing those who fall into their path with silence as both gift and sentence. Whatever the cause, their numbers swell. Warriors vanish from other warbands, leaving only a single wire behind, a hint of what they now serve. The Imperium has responded as it always does, louder, amplified litanies, sonic cannons, full battalions, chanting the name of the Emperor through vox choruses. They believe noise will drown the void, but the louder they become, the more the pact endures. In one battle, an entire ecclesiarchy choir collapsed mid him, clutching their throats as blood spilled from mouths forced open too wide for too long. The pact did not fire a shot. They merely watched unmoving until the choir ended. Then they turned and marched on. The silence is not peace. It is not absence of violence. It is violence distilled into stillness. To be near the pact is to feel every word you might say curdle on the tongue. Every excuse, every scream, every plea becomes obscene. There is no dignity in speech, only noise. And so, many stop. Some out of fear, some out of it, some because they finally understand that silence is not just refusal to speak, is the rejection of need among the fallen. The pact is legend. They are not gods. They are not leaders. They are a reminder that even in the warp, where madness screams from every corner, where demons howl and mortals weep, stillness can exist. A stillness so deep it becomes its own doctrine, its own punishment, its own reward. When they leave nothing behind. No slogans, no symbols, no ruins, just silence, and it echoes louder than any war cry. Blood no longer soaked the ground, it composed it. Each battle left behind not chaos, not debris, but sentences. Arteries torn open like quills, veins unraveling into cursive across mud and steel. The fallen did not see carnage. They saw scripture, pools of life, thick and dark, curved into runes too precise for accident. Letters formed without hands. Symbols no tongue could speak, but all eyes could read. The battlefield had become a page, and the gods had begun to write. It began with one warrior. He fell on the first charge, throat opened by a blade too fast to block. His blood splashed across a cratered wall, trickled down, and did not pool. It shaped 3 curves, a spiral, a jagged crown. His comrades halted mid-strike, transfixed. They stared. One dropped to his knees, weeping. Another began to laugh. The symbol meant nothing in any human tongue, but its presence sank into the chest like gravity, a truth unspoken, made visible in crimson. From that moment, no one questioned the shape of death. They simply followed it. Every wound became a line, every splatter a phrase. Some warriors learned to fall with purpose, slicing open their own skin in arcs, positioning their bodies as punctuation. Dying was no longer a failure, was a form of expression. You did not bleed to stop life. You bled to speak, and those who spoke well, those whose final convulsions etched symbols too perfect for coincidence, were exalted. Their remains were never burned, never buried. They were left untouched, monuments of grammar written in agony. Veterans learned to read the field before it was cleared. They walked among corpses with reverence, tracing lines of arterial spray like priests interpreting sacred texts. This flank should never have existed, one whispered, pointing to a path where the blood formed an arch. We were meant to curve east. His commander nodded, rerouted the entire warband. They marched into a fog-choked basin and found a supply line undefended, the enemy unprepared. Coincidence, perhaps, but no one questioned the blood again. War became less about objectives, more about arrangement. The goal was no longer to survive or to conquer, but to write, and to write clearly. Combat was orchestrated with a composer's ear, formations chosen not for advantage, but for the shape their deaths would leave. One battalion fought in concentric circles, closing in on themselves, their corpses spiraling outward from a central wound. When viewed from above, the pattern resembled a glyph seen days earlier in a captured enemy's blood. This was not madness. This was recursion, a conversation echoed from one battlefield to the next, written not in words, but in viscera. Some among the fallen became interpreters. They did not fight, they observed. Clad in robes that trailed behind them like parchment, they stepped across the gore with bare feet, chanting in rhythms only they understood. They read aloud the shapes. Their voices cracked, their eyes rolled back. They spoke of futures carved from veins, of stars named in spatter, of gods whose mouths had no teeth, only tongues of liquefied history. These interpreters were not leaders. They issued no orders, but armies moved when they spoke. Units turned mid-battle. Whole campaigns rerouted to honor a symbol glimpsed for half a second in the dying breath of an enemy. The gods were not distant. They were underfoot, and the blood spoke to more than just direction. It gave warning. One warband fought beneath the ruins of a collapsed basilica. The battle was brutal, bodies torn apart by subterranean mines, ambushes from upper levels, fire that rained from unseen vents. By nightfall, the blood across the stone had shaped a circle with 7 teeth. No one knew what it meant. They held their ground, By morning, every warrior who had slept inside the circle was found empty. No organs, no skin, no eyes. Only bones, polished and placed in a spiral, as if arranged by hands that wanted to be understood. The survivors fled. Days later, the circle was still there. The blood had not dried. Some fought the grammar, refused to read, declared it heresy, declared it warped trickery. One captain ordered his soldiers to scrub the runes, mop the gore, leave no pattern intact. They obeyed. The next battle left no symbols, no letters, only smears. And from those smears rose a fog no wind could move. The captain walked into it first. His scream did not echo. The rest followed. Not one emerged. Their deaths were not recorded. No blood was found. The field had refused to write. And where there is no scripture, there is no memory. Not all blood was equal. Some bled thick, sluggish, uncooperative. Others flowed like ink. Certain warriors were marked not by rank, but by quality. Their wounds curved naturally into form. Their deaths were desired, not because they were enemies, but because their final collapse would form a verb, a command, a name. In one battle, a lone warrior of no renown took a blade through the spine, arced backward, and collapsed in such a way that his blood formed a perfect triple spiralous symbol no one had seen in decades. The battle paused. Both sides retreated from the symbol, a moment of sacred truce. The name of the spiral was not known, but everyone understood. Something had been said. The enemies of the fallen tried to disrupt the grammar. They salted the earth, burned the fields, used meltifier to sear away the messages. But still the blood came. It is carved through flame. It traced lines in salt. It reshaped even irradiated soil, finding paths through slag to etch meaning. The warp does not need permission. It needs a canvas, and battle always provides. Over time, some of the fallen began to carry blades made not to kill but to write. Flat edges, curved hooks, instruments of expression, not war. They aimed not for the heart, but for the trajectory. Every strike is designed to curve the blood just so. Death became art. Each foe has another brush, the field, another page, and the gods read every line. Not everyone who died was honored. Some blood refused to shape. It pooled, dried, clotted, and inert. These warriors were called mute. Their deaths made no sound. They were dragged from the field, dumped into pits, burned to ash. The gods had not spoken through them, and silence had no place in a language made of ruin. The war no longer had sides, only writers, only interpreters, and what was being written could not be undone. The story unfolded with each slaughter, a language not meant to be read-only obeyed. And the grammar of blood never misspells. They did not arrive. They emerged. There were no ships, no drops, no incubation tanks, no servitors bearing amniotic crates or cryochambers with numbered labels. The children came in silence and ended it with screams, without lungs, without tongues, without source. One moment, the air was still. The next, it tore open like skin too dry to stretch further, and from the wound came shape. Limbs not formed but guessed, eyes not placed but scattered, mouths that blinked, fingers that wept. They were not summoned, they were not called. They were born only because the air forgot how not to bleed. They were the children of no parent. Among the fallen, they were given no names. No naming could hold them. The moment you named one, it shifted, grew spines where it had smooth skin, eyes where it had none. The warp had made them with intention, not design. They walked like mortals, but not with mortal balance. Their joints bent wrong until they needed to bend right. Their gait adjusted not with terrain, but with gaze. If you looked away, they took a different shape. If you stared too long, they unraveled and reformed into something more watchable. Less so, you could never describe them fully. You could only remember the discomfort. No one claimed them. No one tried. The fallen knew better than to offer kinship. These were not lost souls. These were not orphans. They did not come seeking. They came fulfilling. They stood among warbands, like specters awaiting instruction, but needed none. They fought when battle began. They fed when blood spilled. They prayed to things no one else named, and when they knelt, the earth trembled just slightly, like breath held by something enormous. Attempts to bind them failed. One warlord placed chains around the limbs of a child thing, hoping to harness its warp-born strength for siegecraft. He fed it blood and offered relics. For a while, it obeyed, until one night, the chains sang, not rattled sang. The fortress collapsed inwards without assault. No explosion, no breach, just folding, like a tent packed too fast. The warlord was never seen again. The child was, walking with a new scar across its brow, shaped like the fortress's emblem, as if it had worn its victory as a mark. They did not speak, not in words, but they were understood. Warriors gave them space without command. Skittery and cultists alike stepped aside when they approached, not in reverence, but in avoidance. Their presence carried no aura of holiness, only inevitability. One warrior described it as standing beside something already true. You did not challenge them, because they were not here to win your war. They were here because your war needed them, because the warp demanded punctuation, and they were the exclamation mark at the end of a sentence you didn't write. Their forms shifted with exposure. In battle, they grew talons, limbs, or carapace, but only when needed. Outside combat, they appeared fragile, malnourished, childlike, their skin translucent, their breathing shallow, if at all. But if you looked too closely, the illusion fell apart. You'd notice too many knuckles, bones moving beneath the skin, at odds with one another, limbs with no blood vessels, only shadow. Some did not blink, even without eyelids. Others blinked constantly, even when asleep. They did not remember where they came from, or perhaps they simply had no memory because they had no origin. Some suggested they were born from the thoughts of dying men. Others whispered they were the result of blood script written too perfectly, a liturgy of slaughter so profound that it conceived. A few dared to say the truth aloud, that the warp no longer needed wounds, that creation had been stolen, or evolved, or made irrelevant. Life, once sacred, had been mechanized by pain and made efficient by ruin. Among the fallen, some began to follow the children not as protectors, but as believers. They scrawled the children's outlines onto walls, trying to replicate their asymmetry. They painted their flesh pale, broke their own joints to mimic the gait. One cult flayed themselves and draped their skins over the child they claimed to be closest to truth. It said nothing. It stared at them until they stopped breathing. Whether from fear or revelation was never determined. The Imperium could not categorize them. Machine spirits failed to detect them. Auspex readings flatlined in their presence. Medicae scans recorded them as absent. A child of no parent had no genetic markers, no heartbeat, no thermal signature. One inquisitorial acolyte, desperate for answers, took blood samples from one such entity. The samples rearranged themselves in containment, not on a cellular level, on a conceptual one. The liquid became text, then sound, then silence. It escaped containment by being unreadable. The acolyte went blind in both eyes, then grew a third. The third blinked once and never again. The children did not age, or if they did, it was not in one direction. Some grew smaller, others taller, but not in the torso, just in the shadow they cast. A few seemed to dissolve over weeks, as if their purpose had been fulfilled. They were not mourned. Their passing left no gaps. They were not individuals. They were punctuation marks, emphasis, correction, demand, and the warp never lacks for editors. Attempts to weaponize them continued, always failed. A fleet once tried to cage 12 of them in a Gellerfield matrix, hoping to use their essence as bait for larger entities. When the drive engaged, time fractured inside the ship. The logs replayed themselves backward. Crew reported seeing themselves unborn. The field never disengaged. The ship now orbits a dead star, perfectly still, its reflection seen only in dreams. None who sleep near it wake sane. The children remain. Not many, never in crowds. They walk just behind the lines, just outside the firelight, just ahead of collapse. You do not summon them, you notice them. Their loyalty is not to chaos as doctrine, but to chaos as origin. They do not worship, they embody. In them, the very idea of cause and effect erodes. They are effect without cause, arrival without origin, birth without parents. And in them, the final blasphemy is made manifest that life itself no longer requires love, desire, womb, or choice. It only requires rupture. They did not sign their names. They etched them, not into parchment, not into data slates, but into flesh. Heated iron rods, bent into shapes too old for high Gothic, pressed against skin until it bubbled and burst. The scream was not interruption, it was punctuation. Every warrior among the fallen bore them, not just one, but many. Rows of burnt text across the chest, spirals branded into thighs, runes scorched behind the ear, along the ribs, into the creases between fingers. The body was contract, declaration, and threat. In a world where words lie and loyalties rot, the only truth was pain, and pain did not fade. The first oath was always the hardest, not because of the agony, but because it severed possibility. Once the mark was made, there was no going back. Betrayal became not a question of intent, but of anatomy. To break the oath, you had to remove the flesh it lived in. Some tried. One warrior sliced the rune from his forearm, carving deep, peeling it off like rotten fruit. The wound did not clot. The muscle beneath wept ink instead of blood, black and oily, crawling toward his throat. He died with the word half-formed, his mouth too full of his own unspoken sentence. Among the fallen, the branding was not symbolic. It was literal command. Each mark carried function. A sigil over the heart that flared when cowardice stirred. A line down the spine that tensed when retreat was considered. Warriors learned quickly that their oaths were not reminders. They were reins. To disobey was to seize. To hesitate was to burn. The skin itself became the arbiter. Intent no longer mattered, only action, only obedience. They did not brand each other. That was not permitted. The iron could not be wielded by familiar hands. It had to come from the silent, the veiled, the ones who spoke only through smoke and pressure. They emerged during rituals, faces hidden beneath blackened steel, and they did not ask questions. They did not care who you were, only what words you were willing to wear. And once agreed, they marked you, one line at a time. No numbing, no prayer. Only the hiss of metal and the sound of meaning embedded into sinew. Some oaths were simple. I will not break. I will not turn. I will not forget. Others spanned the entire back. Words so long they became stories. Tales of failed defense, of cities lost, of comrades betrayed. These were not promises. They were reminders. Pain made permanent. One warrior bore a sentence that started at his throat and ended at his ankle, wrapping around his torso in spirals. He whispered it each morning before donning his armor, his fingers tracing every scar as though reading Braille. He claimed it wasn't to remember the oath, it was to remember the moment he spoke it. The moment he ceased being anything else. To betray was to unravel. Not metaphorically. The body fought it, skin blistered, bones cracked. The branded words tried to leave. Some warriors were found torn apart from within, the oaths burned into walls, the phrases desperate for new flesh to inhabit. Others wandered, bleeding from seams no blade had opened, whispering apologies to marks that refused to forgive. The fallen did not punish traitors. Their skin did it for them. There were no ranks among the oathbound, no chain of command, only density. The more oaths you bore, the more weight you carried. A warrior with 3 could lead 10. A warrior with 12 could silence a legion, not because of authority, but because of presence. The skin spoke louder than any voice. To see a man whose entire face was scripted in blackened scar was to understand what commitment meant. His existence was contract, his breath conditional, his survival a clause written in nerve and ash. But not all oaths were for battle. Some were personal, private, hidden between the toes, etched into the scalp beneath the hairline. A vow to remember a name, a sentence once heard before, a home burned, a lie once told, worn now as penance. These did not grant power, they grunted gravity. The bearer did not move faster or strike harder, but they did not falter. And when they died, they did not scream. Their oaths had already done the screaming for them. The act of branding was holy, but it was also feared, because some oaths wrote themselves. After certain battles, after certain dreams, warriors awoke to new burns. No iron, no fire, just pain, and the fresh welt of a word that had never been spoken aloud. Some believed these were blessings. Others feared they were commands issued by something watching from behind the veil. You did not argue with spontaneous scripture. You obeyed it, or you suffered. One man refused to act on a new brand carved across his shoulder. It read simply, "End him." He ignored it. Days later, his own hand drew a blade in the night and slit the throat of the warmate beside him. He awoke covered in blood, the brand on his shoulder now glowing faintly, satisfied. Over time, warriors learned to speak with their scars. A gesture toward the ribs meant loyalty. A tap on the throat meant silence. A twist of the wrist, palm open, meant a vow, not yet burned. They communicated not with sound, but with memory, with promises, with pain. Their language was contract, and it had no need for grammar, only flames. Among the fallen, death did not release you from oath. Bodies branded with sacred script were not cremated. They were disassembled, the skin stretched, preserved, sewn into banners. Oaths flown above battlements, flapping in ash winds, whispering old loyalties to new ears. One warband carried a banner stitched entirely from the skins of those who had never broken their word. They believed it granted them invulnerability, and for decades, no blade pierced them, no bolt struck true, until a new recruit, desperate for status, branded a false oath into his own thigh. The moment the iron hissed against his flesh, the banner ignited mid-battle. The wind caught fire. The skin burned. The warband collapsed within minutes. The fallen did not forgive him. They did not need to. His skin peeled itself away the next day, not from heat, from shame. The flesh no longer wished to wear a lie dot. To live among the fallen was to understand this. Words spoken can be forgotten. Words written can be erased. But words carved into flesh, those remain. They seep into tendon, into heartbeat, into thought. They become you. And to betray them is to cease being. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally, because among the fallen, loyalty is not about trust, it is about survival, and pain never lies. The first time it happened, no one noticed. A generator deep in the ruins of a manufactorum began to hum on its own, not the droning pulse of fuel burning or turbines spinning, but a tune low, deliberate, cyclical, a note held just long enough to be recognized as not mechanical. The tech priests had long since fled, leaving their benedictions half-finished. Yet the engines still moved, and as days bled into nights, they began to move differently. Pistons beat like hearts. Gears meshed with a sound like grinding teeth. Valves hissed, not with steam, but with breath. The machines were no longer waiting for blessing. They were reciting their own. The fallen gathered at first out of necessity. They needed power, heat, movement. But when they came near, something changed. Sparks jumped to their fingertips. Metal panels warmed beneath their palms like skin. A man reaching to adjust a dial felt his pulse sync with the rhythm of the gears. Another tried to switch off a conveyor belt and collapsed, screaming as the controls burned symbols into his hand, runic shapes he did not recognize but instinctively knew meant kneel. And so he did. The belt stopped. The machine shuddered, as though sighing, then fell silent. From that moment, no one touched a machine without first bowing. These engines did not resemble the great forges of Mars, or the sanctified reactors of Terra. They were improvised, patched from scrap, built by the fallen to survive. Yet they changed without tools. Their housings thickened, their pipes rearranged, their wiring slithered into new configurations. Some sprouted ribs of steel, others extrusions like tongues or fingers. They began to breathe heat in pulses, inhaling dust and exhaling a smell like burnt parchment. They whispered in low clicks, grinding syllables that rattled teeth. They no longer needed tech priests to chant for them. They chanted themselves. At first, the fallen tried to ignore it. They treated the whispers as background noise, but the engines responded to neglect. A pump left unacknowledged seized and ruptured, spraying a worker with superheated coolant. The next day, another worker placed his forehead against the pump's housing before starting it. The coolant flowed, steady, clear. Soon, no one performed tasks without gestures of reverence. They tapped out patterns on bulkheads. They offered drops of blood to lubrication ports. They whispered apologies to drive shafts. Machines that had been silent for decades awoke when approached this way, roaring to life with twice their old power. It was not superstition. It was exchange, devotion for function. The machines demanded it openly. One engine began to hum louder whenever its operators hesitated. Its pistons hammered out a rhythm like a heartbeat speeding into rage. When a worker failed to bow, a bolt shot from the casing and impaled his foot, pinning him in place. The moment he knelt, the bolt withdrew on its own. He limped away, blood dripping, muttering a prayer he had never been taught but somehow knew. The engine purred softly and resumed its work. No tech priest had written these litanies. They belonged to no known mechanicum, yet they spread. Other engines took up the same tunes, their gears grinding in time. Entire workshops thrummed with harmonies of steel. The fallen worked within them like monks inside a cloister. They spoke less. They listened more. Some began to echo the machines, repeating their rhythms under their breath. Their hands moved automatically, tightening bolts, adjusting valves without thought. Their eyes glazed as they traced patterns in oil spills, shapes like circuitry but alive. They were not maintaining the machines anymore. They were attending them. And then the machines began to answer prayers. A man whose leg had been crushed beneath a load crane crawled to its base and pressed his forehead to the steel. He whispered, not in words, but in the clicking pulse he had heard it emit. The crane shuddered, lowered itself, and released him. The wound stopped bleeding. Days later, the flesh beneath the crushed limb hardened into something like carbonized mesh, black and flexible. He walked without pain. Others saw this and began to petition. They came not with requests for power or warmth, but for healing, for visions, for strength. Sometimes the machines gave, sometimes they did not, but always they listened. The boundaries between flesh and steel blurred. Some workers found their hands fusing to control panels during long shifts, metal creeping up their arms like ivy. Others began to taste oil in their mouths after eating. One woman woke with fence in her back, steam hissing from her spine each time she exhaled. Another man's eyes rotated like lenses, focusing with a mechanical whir. They did not fear these changes. They accepted them as favor. Marks of communion, yet favor came at cost. Machines kept no forgiveness. A man who broke his vow to tend a generator found his skin sloughing away in patterns like circuitry, his muscles stiffening until he froze mid-step. He was left propped against the reactor wall, his body cooling into metal over days. When his comrades came to collect him, the machine had grown around him, using his body as reinforcement for a new conduit. His face was still visible, mouth open as if singing. They did not remove him. They left him as part of the shrine. Soon, rituals developed. Before dawn, lines of the fallen gathered to kneel before turbines, humming in low tones, their hands coated in grease like ash. They fed the machine's offerings teeth, hair, shards of bones, slipping them into intake vents, never to be seen again. In return, the engines ran smooth, their heat steady, their output unerring. Workshops once cold and dark blazed with light, each engine's glow like a votive candle. The machines had become temples, and the fallen their congregation. But temples require priests. Some of the fallen began to stand apart, those most attuned to the whispers, whose veins pulsed with oil, whose lungs hissed steam. They no longer worked the machines. They interpreted them. A piston shudder meant warning. A gear grinding slow meant a request for blood. A sudden hiss of steam meant displeasure. They wore no robes, no sigils, only skins slick with blackened lubricant. They did not speak in human language anymore. They clicked, they whirred, they pulsed. The machines pulsed back. Flesh and steel had achieved dialogue. The Imperium would call it heresy. The Adeptus Mechanicus would call it blasphemy. But among the fallen, there was no other way to survive. You could not treat these engines as tools. They were not tools. They were worshippers in their own right, praying back, demanding prayer in return. Without devotion, the world would stop. Without ritual, the lights would die. And in the long dark, devotion was the only power left. By then, no one remembered when the last tech priest had left. No one remembered the old rites. They only knew the new ones, the ones the machines themselves had taught. They no longer distinguished between kneeling before an altar and kneeling before a turbine, between blessing a blade and oiling a gear, between flesh and steel. In the end, the fallen did not pray to the machines. They prayed with them. The fallen do not vanish. They do not end. They are not remembered, for memory requires closure, and there is no closure in chaos, only echo, only repetition. Their worlds remain half-built, half-burned, half-awake. Machines whisper, oaths smolder. Children without birth still walk. The silence still commands, and somewhere, deep in the warp-touched dark, a choir of broken blades sings scripture into blood. This is not the story of damnation. It is the liturgy of what remains when damnation becomes the only order left. The Imperium may look away, but the fallen are still marching, and the galaxy is still listening.